The moment I pulled into Pinewood Estates, I knew I wasn't just entering a neighborhood. I was entering a theater of control. It was early spring, the kind of morning where the sky was a polished blue, so perfect it feels suspicious. Rows of identical houses blinked in the sunlight like Stepford sentinels. Lawns cut at military angles. Flower beds arranged like color-coded spreadsheets. Not a single rogue dandelion in sight, which should have been my first clue something was very wrong. I rolled in behind the wheel of my Jeep, matte black, custom-reinforced, Federal Registry tags hidden behind civilian plates. It looked like your average, overbuilt weekend warrior vehicle. But underneath, it was a moving surveillance rig. GPS triangulators, satellite uplinks, audio capture hardware discreetly tucked onto the dashboard. Government-grade systems, cold and quiet, humming beneath the hood like a sleeping animal. I parked in front of a beige two-story with the personality of dry toast, part of the cover provided by my agency. To the neighbors, I was Marcus Steele, 34, single, newly transferred civil engineer. In reality, I was a wildlife crime investigator embedded in Pinewood under Operation Nightingale, tracking a ring suspected of smuggling endangered species through private suburban homes. It was risky, delicate work, but I didn't expect my first threat to wear pearls. She came striding across the lawn like she owned the sun. "Welcome to Pinewood," she beamed, handing me a gift basket wrapped tighter than airport luggage. "Dolores Crenshaw, president of our lovely HOA. You'll find everything you need inside. Local coupons, scented candle, and our community code of conduct." The binder was heavy, plastic-bound, printed tabs. Embossed front, that read, Pinewood Estates Covenant and Regulation Manual, 14th edition. I hadn't even unlocked my front door before I was being briefed on where I could place my trash cans, the acceptable hues of mulch, and how my porch lights could affect neighbor morale. Dolores had the look of a former prom queen who never got over her crown. Bleached blonde, white BMW SUV idling nearby. Her perfume arrived before she did, thick, floral, and aggressive. Her eyes scanned my Jeep like it was leaking radiation. "Aggressive tires," she noted, lips tight. "Interesting choice." "Mountain roads," I said. "I travel." She didn't ask what for. She just smiled with the brittle confidence of someone who thought they already had me figured out. I smiled back, and that's when it started. The next morning, a fluorescent green notice fluttered on my windshield like a wasp on glass. Vehicle non-compliant. See Section 12.3b. Violación. Overly aggressive exterior aesthetic. Deadline, immediate. 12 hours in a neighborhood, and I was already flagged. I kept my cover. Played the game. Responded with a polite email citing Colorado's vehicular code and my right to park on private property. Attached a copy of my civilian registration. No reply. But the next morning, another notice. This one citing my suspicious departure times. I left at 2 a.m. for a field op 3 towns over. Tracked an exotic bird suspected to be trafficked for black market breeding. When I returned at dawn, a neighbor was watching from her porch with a look that said you don't belong here. That's what Pinewood was, really, a curated illusion. A place designed to look peaceful on the surface where the real currency was control. Appearances were king. Conformity wasn't requested, it was demanded. Anything that didn't fit Dolores's aesthetic was a threat. And I was already radioactive. At the first HOA meeting, I brought donuts. Real ones. From the downtown bakery with the $6 maple bacon specials that make grown men weep. I stood, introduced myself, explained my odd hours, vaguely referencing government contract work. Dolores sat at the head of the table like a suburban Caesar. On either side, Harold, a retired CPA who blinked like he was buffering, Nancy, a yoga instructor who seemed genuinely startled to be awake after sunset, and Pete, an insurance broker who barely looked up from his phone. "Thank you for explaining," Dolores said sweetly. "But rules are rules." She gestured toward a projected slide titled, Neighborhood Harmony, Vehicle Aesthetics and Safety. There was a photo of my Jeep, taken from a low angle that made it look like a military convoy. I recognized the timestamp. 4:37 a.m. Someone had been watching. I let it slide. For now. But something in Dolores shifted that night. a flicker in her expression when I mentioned I was unavailable for the HOA barbecue. She masked it quickly, but I'd seen it before, the offended entitlement, the bruised ego. It wasn't about community standards. It was about power, attention, control. When she couldn't charm me, she'd control me. That's when I knew I wasn't just here to expose a smuggling ring. I was about to go to war with a woman who believed she was the law. The third violation notice came wrapped in pink ribbon. I kid you not. Urge, Jeep modification non compliant. Antenna structures violate visibility standards. You are hereby ordered to remove or replace unauthorized fixtures. The note was signed with concern, the management, and it was stapled to a photograph of my vehicle, taken at night, from across the street, through my window. This wasn't code enforcement. This was surveillance. And Dolores had just made the worst mistake of her life. She'd declared war on a federal agent, and she didn't even know it. I tried to ignore her. Really, I did. In my line of work, poking a narcissist only gives them more air to combust. But Dolores Crenshaw didn't need oxygen. She fed on silence, on compliance. And every time I walked past her house without reacting, I could feel her watching, like a panther pacing behind lace curtains. Still, I stayed focused on the real reason I was here. Operation Nightingale was unfolding quietly beneath the neat little lawns of Pinewood Estates. Exotic bird calls traced to garages. Unusual cargo being loaded at night. A half-dozen properties flagged for suspicious deliveries from shell companies in Florida and Nevada. Every odd movement fed into the task force's growing map. But I had a problem. The surveillance hub was my Jeep. And my Jeep was now public enemy number one to the self-appointed queen of Pinewood. The next notice was hand-delivered. She rang my doorbell with a fake smile and a clipboard so thick it probably had its own zip code. "This is just a courtesy," she said, blinking with faux concern. "We've received multiple complaints about your vehicle. We'll need to assess it for compliance irregularities." I tilted my head. "Is that a legal way of saying you don't like how it looks?" Her smile faltered. "I'm just enforcing community standards," she said, tone clipped. "It's not personal." "It is now," I replied and shut the door. That week, I found a scratch on the side panel. Not deep, but deliberate. A warning. That same night, I caught her outside around 2 a.m. pacing near my driveway. She pretended to be walking her cat, in a leopard print robe and kitten heels. I turned on the floodlights. She froze, deer in headlights, then scurried off like a roach under kitchen light. The next morning, I was hit with a formal notice citing excessive exterior lighting. Then came the meeting, the real ambush. I showed up because I believe in due process. Big mistake. The room smelled like burnt coffee and tension. Dolores presided at the front like a judge, wearing a pale cream suit that made her look like she'd just stepped off a luxury cruise, minus the ethics. Today's emergency meeting concerns Mr. Steele's non-compliant vehicle, she announced with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice, clicking a remote. A slideshow began. Photos of my Jeep from every angle. Circles, arrows, text boxes. One photo had been doctored poorly. It showed my Jeep extending onto a neighbor's driveway. Problem is, that neighbor had moved out 3 weeks earlier. The driveway was empty. Violation of community boundary lines, she declared. Aesthetic aggression. Safety concerns due to suspicious attachments. Harold nodded like a bobblehead. Pete didn't look up. Nancy looked like she wanted to be reincarnated as a plant. I stayed calm. Presented my paperwork. Registration, federal exemption clause, all legal. Even explained that my vehicle, while unmarked, was government issued. Dolores smirked. Anyone can say they're federal. You could be anyone. She snapped to the next slide. A blown-up screenshot of my Jeep's rear antenna array. We've consulted with local automotive specialists. These are not standard civilian fixtures. I leaned back. That's because they're not. Her eyes flashed. The board has voted. Daily fines of $200 until the vehicle is removed or brought into aesthetic compliance. I stood up. You do understand what constitutional supremacy is, right? Dolores didn't answer, but her smile said she thought she was the Constitution. After that, it escalated fast. Neighbors stopped making eye contact. Sideways glances followed me like shadows. A Facebook post surfaced from a local group, Pinewood Parents for Neighborhood Safety. It warned of a suspicious newcomer exhibiting unusual surveillance behavior. The post didn't name me, but didn't have to. And then came Dolores's social media campaign. She'd always crave an audience. Now she had one. Cryptic posts about government interference. Hashtags like hashtag protect our community and hashtag eyes on steel. She even shared blurry photos of my Jeep with captions like, "Is this what safety looks like to you? Why are men like this watching our children?" The comments range from confused to conspiratorial. Who needs all that tech in a family neighborhood? I saw him leaving at 3 a.m. again. What is he really doing? Are our kids being watched? It was like watching a wildfire start from a birthday candle. Still, I stayed calm. That's what training does. You let the storm come. You let your enemy believe they're winning until they walk themselves into their own noose. But then she crossed the line. A neighbor, a Vietnam vet named Frank, started leaving handwritten notes under my door. Careful cursive. Supportive. Said he'd seen people like Dolores before, just in different uniforms. That kind of courage comes in quiet envelopes. 3 days later, Frank was hit with a violation notice for improper flag placement. His flagpole had been standing for 12 years. Another neighbor, Mrs. Bennett, an 84-year-old widow who planted pink roses by her mailbox, received a $300 fine for non-compliant flora. Apparently, pink wasn't in the HOA-approved palette. One by one, the pattern became clear. Anyone who supported me became a target. This wasn't rule enforcement. This was a regime. And then came the final straw. I came back from a 2-day field op in Nevada, tired and dust-coated, only to find my driveway empty. No Jeep, just a severed padlock chain glittering under the morning light. And a note. Vehicle towed for noncompliance. Section 12.3b violation. Pinewood Management no contact. No hearing. No warning. Dolores had cut my lock. She'd stolen a federal surveillance vehicle. At 2 in the morning. On security footage, she stood there in pearls and garden gloves, directing the tow truck like a symphony conductor. She had no idea what she'd done. This wasn't towing a nuisance car. She had just committed a federal felony against a federal officer, and she didn't even know it. Yet, the sun was barely up when I stood at the edge of my driveway, staring at the absence like it was a corpse. No Jeep, just tire tracks and silence. A cold metal chain lay, coiled like a dead snake, its padlock severed clean through. Beside it, Dolores's final insult, a laminated notice zip-tied to my mailbox like a hostage tag. Towed due to non-compliant modifications. Vehicle seized per section 12.3b. Pinewood HOA Management. At the bottom was her signature, scrawled in bold cursive, like the Queen of England co-signing an execution. She thought this was a flex, a win. She had no idea what she'd just done. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was now a federal crime. You don't cut a lock off government property. You don't access surveillance-grade tracking systems installed under DOJ contract. And you sure as hell don't tow a classified Jeep outfitted for active investigations across 3 states, especially not when it's assigned to an undercover federal officer. The law wasn't on her side anymore. It was coming for her. I dialed Rodriguez. "Gone," I said. There was a pause. Then, did she access it? "I think so. There's footage." Jesus Christ, Marcus. Rodriguez didn't curse unless it was serious. This was part of Operation Nightingale, I reminded him. She just compromised multi-agency surveillance hardware, tracking smuggling channels from Utah to New Mexico. She might have just exposed 3 years of undercover work. Another pause. Then the line changed tones from personal to tactical. "Document everything. Don't make contact. I'll loop in the bureau. We're escalating." I filed the official report under federal property theft. While the paper trail worked its way up the chain of command, I went to collect what I could. The tow yard sat on the edge of town like a fortress of neglect. Chain-link fences, barbed wire, surveillance cameras pointed inward, not out. A handwritten sign on the office door read, "Rapid recovery towing, no refunds, no exceptions." The air smelled like burnt rubber and broken stories. My Jeep was there, tucked between two wrecked minivans like it was being punished. Dust caked its windows. The license plates had been removed. My interior surveillance gear had been tampered with, the access panel beneath the passenger seat slightly ajar. Dolores or her crew had been inside, and that changed everything. I asked the clerk on duty, a guy with a receding hairline and a toothpick clenched between his teeth, who had ordered the tow. He shrugged. Management request. Signed by a Crenshaw. Said it was a neighborhood security risk. Did she mention federal classification? She mentioned eyesores. I left without further questions. I had what I needed. Time to dig. 2 nights later, I sat in front of 3 monitors in my apartment. Triangulated feeds from security cams, audio mics hidden near the HOA clubhouse, and access logs from the federal database. Everywhere I turned, her name popped up like a fungus. Dolores Crenshaw, property manager, HOA president, enforcer of rules she'd written herself. A background search showed Sunshine Property Management was listed under her sister's name, but Dolores was the sole signer on all contracts. The business wasn't bonded. No insurance. No licensing paperwork with the state. Just a paper shell collecting $300,000 annually from 200 families and funneling a chunk of it through vendor accounts with suspicious overlap. One of those vendors? Rapid Recovery Towing, owned by a shell company, which was owned by Daniel Crenshaw, her brother-in-law, the same guy who towed my Jeep, the same guy who probably rifled through classified tech while Dolores posed in her robe and garden clogs. This wasn't enforcement. This was racketeering, and I wasn't the first. The next day, I went door to door, not with a badge, but with questions. Frank let me in first. His living room was a time capsule of military memorabilia and old discipline. When I told him what Dolores had done, he didn't even blink. She fined me for flying a flag I earned in Vietnam, he said. You think she cares about your rights? Others followed. Janet, 3 doors down, a forensic accountant, retired. Dolores had fined her $300 for planting pink roses. Violated color codes, she muttered. She once said my garden didn't match her vision. The Martinez family had been threatened with towing for an RV they'd legally parked for 6 years. A young mother, Maria, showed me the photos Dolores left anonymously on her porch, images of her backyard taken without consent. Everywhere I looked, I found the same pattern. Fines for imagined violations, towing threats against anyone with valuable property, HOA fees redirected into maintenance projects that never happened, residents too afraid or too weary to fight back until now. That night, we gathered in Frank's garage. 23 homeowners, folding chairs, coffee in mismatched mugs, eyes heavy with months, some years of silence. I showed them the documents, Dolores's shell companies, the falsified meeting minutes, the financial trails looping back to her personal accounts. I'm not here just as a neighbor, I told them. I'm here as a federal officer. And what she's doing isn't just unethical, it's criminal. But we need your voices, your records, your testimony. One by one, they nodded. Some were angry, others afraid. A few cried, but all of them, for the first time, felt the crack in Dolores's armor. 2 days later, we launched the Pinewood Reform Coalition. Encrypted group chats, shared documentation, surveillance logs, a Dropbox folder titled The Evidence Vault. Janet took point on finances. Frank organized outreach. Maria translated notices for Spanish-speaking families who'd been disproportionately targeted. We weren't just angry anymore. We were organized. But Dolores wasn't sitting idle. She smelled resistance like a hound on blood. That same week, she launched a full smear campaign. Anonymous flyers with my face, warning about government monitoring. Cryptic Facebook posts claiming I was a fraud, a threat to children, a deep state plant. She even filed a police report accusing me of covert harassment and military intimidation. The responding officers, who'd coordinated with our federal task force, wrote it up like a comedy sketch. But Dolores was slipping. Paranoia made her reckless. And when she tried to access my impounded Jeep for evidence gathering, she triggered the next level of federal involvement. She'd photographed restricted tech, tried accessing encrypted systems. In doing so, she crossed into espionage territory. Rodriguez called that night. Marcus, She just declared war on 3 federal task forces. She thinks she's untouchable, I said. Good, he replied. Let her keep thinking that. The more she moves, the deeper she digs her own grave. He paused. We've decided. Operation Nightingale is expanding. You're authorized to continue. Document everything. Build the case. When it breaks, it'll be loud. I looked out my window. Dolores's porch light flicked on like a lighthouse warning of approaching storms. Only this time, she was the ship in the crosshairs. If Dolores had a flaw greater than her ego, it was this. She believed no one would dare defy her. Not the scared single mothers she fined for unauthorized visitors. Not the veterans she shamed for flags that weren't HOA-sanctioned beige. Not the neighbors who worked late shifts and got cited for disruptive driveway departures. And certainly not me, the quiet newcomer with a black Jeep and a clipped smile. But Dolores didn't know she'd just stolen from a federal task force. She didn't know my Jeep's antenna wasn't a vanity mod. She didn't know she'd poked a system built for one thing: exposure. The Pinewood Reform Coalition began quietly, but it moved fast. Janet, the forensic accountant with a memory like a ledger, unearthed 6 years of HOA financial irregularities in 3 nights. Frank used his military contacts to trace the towing company's vehicle history. Turns out, half the cars impounded by Rapid Recovery were owned by residents Dolores had filed personal disputes against. Maria started gathering signatures. In 2 days, she'd collected over 80 from neighbors, half of them too nervous to be seen publicly, but desperate for someone to finally confront the monster with manicured nails and a god complex. We'd gone from whispered alliances to full-blown rebellion. And Dolores? She doubled down like all tyrants do. It started with silence. Doors that used to open for community chats stayed shut. The weekly newsletter stopped mentioning the coalition. It stopped altogether. Contractors were warned not to work on the homes of troublemakers. Sidewalks became minefields of passive aggression. Then the real games began. Flyers in mailboxes reading, "Beware, anti-community elements among us. Federal surveillance in your neighborhood. He's watching your children." What? Photos of me were posted on telephone poles, grainy stills pulled from God knows where, labeled with terms like government interference agent and neighborhood infiltrator. It was absurd. It was defamatory. And it was working. One neighbor crossed the street when he saw me. Another mumbled something about just keeping his head down. But I knew fear when I saw it. Fear doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just walks faster. Meanwhile, I was gathering proof like a man assembling a warhead. Janet discovered over $147,000 in HOA funds funneled into fake maintenance vendors, most of which traced back to Dolores's relatives or offshore shell companies. We found forged board meeting minutes authorizing expenditures on dates when board members were out of town, some even out of state. Frank tracked license plates of vehicles doing late-night surveillance near coalition members' homes. One belonged to a private security firm previously investigated for witness intimidation and corporate espionage. And then there was the smoking gun. Dolores had tried to mortgage HOA common property using forged signatures. Her boldest move yet, and the dumbest. The bank flagged the documents immediately. The fraud alert went up the ladder, right into the inbox of the State Housing Authority. And suddenly, I wasn't the only one watching. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit opened a secondary file. The IRS began digging into unreported income. Rodriguez and I prepped the federal sting. But what changed everything, what gave this case its human soul, was the night I knocked on Mrs. Bennett's door. She was 84, a widow, naturalized citizen, the kind of woman who still baked cookies for the mailman. She'd been fined $450 for unauthorized cultural display. Her crime? Flying a slightly oversized American flag on Memorial Day. She handed me the violation notice with trembling hands. "Do you know what it took for me to become a citizen, Mr. Steele?" she asked softly. "Do you know how long I waited to earn the right to fly that flag?" I didn't answer, because there was nothing to say. That night, I wrote the speech. Not the one I'd give to prosecutors. The one I'd give to my neighbors, the one still caught in the fog. I sent it anonymously through the HOA email chain under the subject line, enough. This isn't about me. This is about every resident who paid fees and got fined anyway. About the flag Dolores told Mrs. Bennett to take down. About the veterans fined for their disability ramps. About the single mothers whose visitors were labeled suspicious. This isn't enforcement. This is extortion wrapped in bylaws. This is theft disguised as order. And it ends now. We didn't sign our names, but they knew who we were. And by the following morning, over 100 residents had joined our coalition. The final public hearing approached, the one Dolores had called to resolve the vehicle dispute once and for all. She didn't realize we'd orchestrated the entire setup. Frank coordinated the attendance list. Janet prepared a PowerPoint with over 30 forensic slides. Maria organized the Spanish-speaking neighbors into the first unified voting bloc Pinewood had ever seen. The hearing wouldn't be about my Jeep. It would be about her empire. And the cameras were coming. Local reporters had caught wind of the story. A federal agent. Possible racketeering. National HOA reform blogs picked it up. A Netflix producer emailed me personally. If this explodes, I want the rights. I didn't reply. Not yet. 2 nights before the hearing, Dolores made her last real move. She showed up at my door. Pearls on, lipstick sharp, a manila folder tucked under her arm like a weapon. I want to talk, she said. I opened the door just enough to lean against the frame. You've already said too much. This doesn't have to go public, she hissed. You can walk away. Take a payout. I'll get the Jeep back. We'll say it was a misunderstanding. I almost laughed. Dolores, you cut a federal lock. She stepped closer. You think they'll protect you? These people? This neighborhood? I looked past her at the lights on in every window down the street. Yeah, I said. I think they already are. The day before the hearing, Rodriguez arrived. Not in uniform. Not with a raid team. But with federal authorization and sealed indictments in hand. Tomorrow, he said, placing the file on my kitchen table. We make it official. Janet poured herself coffee. Frank reviewed logistics. Maria organized the resident testimony stack like a general arranging troops. The kitchen smelled like determination and revolution. This wasn't about a Jeep anymore. This was about every community Dolores had poisoned. Every family she'd robbed. Every lie she'd spun to prop up her suburban dictatorship. And now, finally, it was time for her curtain call. The Pinewood Community Center had never seen this many people. The folding chairs groaned beneath the weight of a full neighborhood. Residents packed wall to wall, back straight, arms folded, eyes sharp. The smell was a mix of burnt coffee, sweat, and the kind of silent tension that sits in your chest like a loaded question. Outside, news vans lined the curb. Inside, camera tripods and local reporters waited for the headline. And at the center of it all, Dolores Crenshaw, dressed in defiance. Cream blazer, pearls tight against her throat. A lawyer in tow who looked like he'd rather be representing a mobster with a conscience. She strutted in like royalty, eyes sweeping the crowd. But something had shifted. The whispers didn't stop this time. The glares didn't drop. She was still wearing the uniform of power, but everyone could see she no longer had the army. Frank rolled in first, wheelchair polished, veteran cap straight. Janet followed, laptop tucked under one arm, manila folders under the other. Maria came in with a box of printed testimony, 113 statements, each signed, time-stamped, notarized. I walked in last, not in uniform, but I wore the badge. And when I reached the front and turned to face the crowd, the room hushed. Even the air conditioner stopped humming. I'd like to open this meeting with a clarification, I said, voice even clear. Before we discuss my vehicle, I think it's important everyone understands who I am. I opened the badge wallet. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Federal Task Force Agent. Special Assignment. Operation Nightingale. Gasps spread like ripples through a lake. I've been stationed in Pinewood as part of a federal investigation into endangered species trafficking. My Jeep, the one towed by Ms. Crenshaw, was federal property, outfitted with surveillance and tracking technology used to monitor illegal wildlife trade routes across 3 states. Dolores stood. Objection. This isn't a courtroom, I interrupted. But if you want it to be, we're prepared for that too. Rodriguez stepped forward from the back of the room. A silent, broad-shouldered signal that this wasn't neighborhood theater anymore. This isn't about a Jeep, I continued. It's about systematic abuse of power. Extortion disguised as HOA enforcement. Discrimination posing as aesthetic standards. Theft, fraud, forgery, all wrapped in a veneer of order. I nodded to Janet. She clicked the remote. A screen lit up behind us. Slide 1. $147,000 in embezzled HOA funds. Slide 2. Vendor invoices traced to shell companies linked to Dolores's family. Slide 3. Forged meeting minutes authorizing expenditures that never occurred. Slide 4. A paper trail from HOA accounts to offshore banking institutions. Slide 5. Federal documentation of espionage. Classified equipment photographed and tampered with during the illegal tow. The room was dead quiet. Dolores sat down. Her lawyer whispered furiously into her ear. But she didn't move, didn't blink, just stared forward like a statue carved from panic. And then, one by one, the residents stood. Frank first. She fined me $300 for having my wheelchair ramp painted blue, he said. Said it clashed with a neighborhood pallet. Mrs. Bennett stood next. She threatened me for flying the American flag. Told me it was too loud. Maria stepped forward. She put a camera in my backyard. Said she was monitoring for safety. My kids were playing. That's what she filmed. Then came Tom, the quiet man from the cul-de-sac with the old fishing boat. She charged me $500 for storing a marine vessel. That boat's been in my driveway for 10 years. My wife died on it. The room swelled with stories. Real pain, real theft, real fear, finally spoken out loud. And Dolores, the woman who once ruled with letters and fines and HOA codes, sat in the eye of the storm she created. Pearls unmoving, hands shaking, lipstick cracking. Then came a knock. 3 sharp raps on the double doors. They opened, and in stepped the U.S. Marshals, flanked by IRS agents, state housing regulators, and 2 men in dark suits from the DOJ. Rodriguez nodded. The signal. Dolores Crenshaw, said the lead marshal, reading from a document the thickness of a phone book. You are under arrest for the following charges: wire fraud, mail fraud, theft of federal property, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit racketeering, embezzlement, falsification of legal documents, violation of the Fair Housing Act, and potential breaches of the Espionage Act. Gasps exploded. Cameras flashed. Reporters surged forward. Dolores stood too fast, knocked over her chair, reached for her purse like it held dignity instead of lip gloss and panic. This is harassment, she shrieked. This is political. You forged documents, Janet said, stepping forward. You stole from your neighbors. You threatened children. I am the president of this community. Dolores screamed. I built this neighborhood. No, Frank said from his chair. We did. You just stole the credit. The marshals moved in. The click of the cuffs was loud enough to silence the world. They walked her past the rows of folding chairs, past the veterans, the mothers, the teachers, the working families, the people she called beneath her, and they watched her go, not with hate, but with relief. Outside, the cameras rolled. The headline was already being written. HOA president arrested for federal crimes after harassing undercover agent. A documentary producer whispered to Janet. The Netflix deal was already real, but we weren't celebrating yet, because the final victory wasn't her arrest. It was what came next. I stood before the crowd one last time. We don't fix this by removing one person, I said. We fix it by remembering what neighborhoods are for. Not control, but community. Not fines, but fairness. Maria raised the box of signatures. We have enough to call an emergency board vote. The crowd erupted. Democracy, reborn in folding chairs. Frank saluted. Janet exhaled for the first time in months. Mrs. Bennett hugged me. The lights of the community center flickered as the power shifted, not back to one person, but to all of them. As Dolores was loaded into the black federal vehicle, her screams muffled by closed doors, I looked down at the scarred driveway where my Jeep had once been towed away. It was quiet now, not the silence of fear, but the silence of something sacred. Justice. 2 weeks after Dolores Crenshaw's arrest, The Pinewood HOA board voted unanimously to dissolve her management contract. No one opposed it. Not even Pete, who once checked his phone through every meeting, voted yes with shaking hands. Harold didn't show up at all. Rumor said he'd moved in with his daughter out of state. No forwarding address. Nancy left a note on her yoga studio door that simply said, "I'm sorry." But this story wasn't about them anymore. It was about the ones who stayed, and the ones who stood up. The new board was voted in by a standing room-only crowd. Maria Santos, third-grade teacher, was elected president. Robert Kim, an ICU nurse, became treasurer. Frank, retired veteran, wheelchair-bound, unbreakable, was elected vice president unanimously. And Janet? Janet became the first-ever community oversight auditor, a position invented just for her, because, frankly, she'd earned the right to double-check every damn decimal point for the rest of time. Their first order of business was transparency. Monthly budgets were posted online. Board meetings were live-streamed. And the bylaws were rewritten with something Dolores never considered: humanity. Discrimination was banned outright. Anonymous complaints were no longer accepted. Violations required documentation, board consensus, and most importantly, actual empathy. Then came the symbolic act. A vote on what to do with the grassy common lot Dolores used to measure with a ruler. The one she threatened to fine kids for stepping on. Janet proposed a garden. Not just flowers, she said, standing in front of the crowd. Something useful. Something we grow together. They named it the Marcus Steele Community Garden. I didn't ask for that. Didn't expect it. But standing there on the day we broke ground, shovel in hand, with Mrs. Bennett planting tulips beside me, and Frank directing irrigation lines from his chair like he was commanding a battlefield, I understood. Sometimes justice isn't the courtroom. It's the garden planted where the fear used to be. Dolores? She pleaded guilty. 23 federal charges. White fraud, mail fraud, obstruction, racketeering, and espionage for photographing classified surveillance tech inside a federally registered Jeep. She tried the mental health defense. It failed. Her lawyer argued for a reduced sentence. The judge responded by reading aloud the testimonies of elderly homeowners fined for having doorbells the wrong color. She was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. No pedos, no power, just state-issued beige. The restitution totaled $380,000. The court froze her assets, seized the BMW, and placed liens on her personal accounts, including the offshore ones Janet traced with forensic precision. But the most important thing? She could never manage a property again. Anywhere. The story didn't end up on just local news. It went national. Cable interviews, true crime podcasts, an HOA abuse documentary pitched at Netflix, working title, Queen of Suburbia. I passed on the interviews. Let the others speak. Janet told her story better than I ever could. Frank gave the quote of the year. She thought a clipboard made her God. Turns out, it just made her a criminal with stationery. As for me, I could have left, transferred out, taken a promotion, been reassigned to a new wildlife trafficking task force in Florida. But I didn't, because for the first time in years, I wasn't just undercover. I was part of something real. Community. I bought the house I was renting, tore out the hyper-manicured lawn, and planted native grasses and vegetables. Joined the board, not as a fed, but as a neighbor. Janet and I started spending more time together. Late-night talks, budget spreadsheets that turned into shared dinners, federal reports turned into garden plans. Turns out, forensic accounting and field work make a surprisingly solid relationship foundation. Go figure. 1 year after Dolores' arrest, we held the first HOA Accountability Day. Workshops on tenant rights. Speakers on discrimination law. A civil liberties attorney from Denver came to talk about the importance of transparency in neighborhood governance. And Frank, sitting beneath a handmade banner that read, "Communities are built, not controlled," gave the closing speech. We didn't fight a war overseas to come home and lose one to lawn fines and paper tyrants. Justice doesn't come in the form of fear. It comes when neighbors look each other in the eye and say, "I see you. I respect you. And I won't let anyone hurt you again." People cried, not because they were afraid anymore, but because they weren't. That night, As the stars came out and the garden lights flickered on, I stood beside the beds of tomatoes and lavender and rosemary, watching a kid run barefoot across the grass Dolores once ruled like a despot. He laughed. His mom didn't stop him. No violations. No photos. No threats. Just a boy being free. In a neighborhood that finally remembered what it meant to be one. Later, I walked back to my Jeep, the same one Dolores had towed like a trophy. It gleamed now, fully restored. Official markings visible under streetlights. I leaned against the hood and watched the sky. Peace isn't always quiet. Sometimes it's loud, earned through chaos, paperwork, and grit. But tonight, it was silent. Not from fear, but from relief. From healing. From victory. She ruled by fear. We rebuilt with truth. And in the end, the garden grew where the fear once lived.